I'd like to welcome you all to this public meeting of the Board of Promotions, in which Marie Hansen-Couturier will defend her thesis. I would like to invite you to give your public lecture or your short summary of your thesis to us. Please be seated.
Geachte voorzitter, geachte aanwezigen, lieve familie en vrienden. Welkom hier in de Pieterskerk. Ik ben echt heel blij om jullie allemaal te zien. En meteen aan het begin van dit lekenpraatje wil ik jullie graag in gedachten meenemen naar een andere kerk in Utrecht. Misschien wil je, als dat comfortabel voelt, even je ogen dicht doen. Bij die andere kerk is een zaal. Het is een grote ruimte met hoge ramen en muren. Aan de muren hangen 8 tekeningen, die allemaal gaan over een Bijbelverhaal dat we net hebben gelezen. Het is het verhaal van Thomas, die de wonden van de opgestane Jezus wil aanraken. Johannes 20, vers 19 tot 29. Er klinkt muziek. 8 vrouwen, waaronder ik, dansen. We dansen met het verhaal van Thomas en de gewonde Jezus nog in ons achterhoofd. Hoe zit het met onze eigen wonden? Durven we die te laten zien in een dans? Of dansen we liever stoer, alsof niemand ons iets kan maken? Kunnen stoerheid en gewondheid samengaan? De ruimte is gevuld met dansende vrouwen en met emotie. Ook ik dans, maar het valt me zwaar. Mijn lijf voelt zwaar. De tranen branden achter mijn ogen en even later stromen ze over mijn wangen. En toch dans ik. Met het verdriet. Met de pijn. Ik kijk naar mijn tekening aan de muur. Naar Thomas, die met zijn eigen wonden bij de gewonde Jezus zit. En ik kijk om me heen naar de andere vrouwen. Ik zie tranen en ook zoveel veerkracht. Levenslust. Kracht. In onze dans zie ik, kwetsbaarheid en kracht komen samen. Lijf en theologie komen samen. En nu terug naar jullie, naar ons hier en nu. Je mag je ogen open doen, als je die dicht had. En een stukje van dit gedachte-experiment blijft hier bij ons. In de vorm van de tekening die hier vooraan staat en die u ook op de beamer kunt zien. Deze tekening is de voorkant van mijn proefschrift geworden. Deze tekening komt uit mijn onderzoek. Het is een tekening die ik maakte naar aanleiding van dat Bijbelverhaal over Thomas en Jezus. Een Bijbelverhaal dat centraal staat in mijn onderzoek. Wat heb ik onderzocht? In mijn onderzoek gaat het over het ontwikkelen van een trauma-sensitieve theologie. Trauma-sensitief, dat betekent met ruimte en aandacht voor verhalen en ervaringen van trauma. Mijn onderzoek gaat over trauma en over de impact daarvan. In mijn onderzoek betoog ik dat de ruimte voor mensen met traumatische ervaringen in kerk en theologie vaak ontbreekt. En ik kijk naar hoe dit anders zou kunnen. Want geloof, kerk en theologie kunnen ook een belangrijke bron van steun zijn. Het ontwikkelen van een traumasensitieve theologie gaat niet zonder de verhalen van mensen die traumatische ervaringen hebben meegemaakt. Daarom spelen de verhalen en inzichten van mensen met traumatische ervaring een belangrijke rol in mijn proefschrift. In mijn proefschrift werk ik specifiek met mensen met ervaring van seksueel misbruik, omdat deze vorm van trauma juist zo'n impact heeft op ons lijf, ook vele jaren later nog. Hoe heb ik dit gedaan? Mijn onderzoek bestaat uit een combinatie van literatuurstudie en veldwerk. Veldwerk is wat we in de academische wereld empirisch onderzoek noemen. In 2019 begon ik met de opzet voor mijn onderzoek. In dat jaar deed ik ook mee met de cursus God en ik? Vraagteken. Hoe verder met God na seksueel misbruik? Van stichting VPSG. In die cursus ervoer ik de kracht van de combinatie van theologie, trauma en werken met je lijf. Zo werd die cursus in 2019 de opstap voor het empirische stuk van mijn onderzoek. En in 2021 deed ik opnieuw mee. In deze cursus lazen we Bijbelverhalen. We mediteerden, we tekenden en we dansten. Het verhaal dat ik jullie aan het begin van dit lekenpraatje vertelde, beschrijft een scène uit een van de cursusochtenden. In de cursus ging het er telkens over of en hoe we ons met onze ervaring van seksueel misbruik opnieuw tot God wilden verhouden. Ik deed 2 keer mee met deze cursus en interviewde in totaal vervolgens 8 vrouwen die ook meegedaan hebben. In de interviews stelde ik vragen over theologie, trauma en ons lijf. Door mee te doen met deze cursus kom ik zelf als persoon ook mee in mijn onderzoek. Mijn eigen ervaring met seksueel misbruik kleurt hoe ik tegen het onderwerp van mijn proefschrift aankijk en welk perspectief ik kan en wil innemen. In mijn onderzoek ben ik nooit een neutrale buitenstaander geweest. En ook daar sta ik vandaag voor. Dat is spannend, want dit is een kwetsbaar onderwerp. En meer nog, dat is nodig. Want ik geloof dat we door ons uit te spreken en verhalen te delen echt iets kunnen veranderen. Wat is er uitgekomen? Uit mijn onderzoek blijkt dat theologie, kerk en trauma geen gemakkelijke combinatie zijn. Alle vrouwen die meededen aan mijn onderzoek hebben ieder op diens eigen manier negatieve ervaringen met kerk en of theologie. Denk bijvoorbeeld aan een kerkgemeenschap die wel de dader, maar niet het slachtoffer steunt. Of iemand die God als excuus gebruikt om het misbruik goed te praten. Kerk, trauma en theologie zijn geen gemakkelijke combinatie. En het kan anders. Ook dat blijkt gelukkig uit mijn onderzoek. Kerkgemeenschappen kunnen bijdragen aan heling. Een relatie tot God kan herstellen. Daarvoor is het nodig dat ervaringen van mensen met trauma gehoord worden. Daarvoor is het nodig dat ons lijf een rol mag spelen in ons theologisch denken en doen. Daarvoor is het nodig dat we ook in kerkgemeenschappen ruimte maken voor trauma. In woord en daad, in liturgie en ritueel. Mijn proefschrift gaat allereerst over het veranderen van theologische denkbeelden. Het gaat om het trauma-sensitief maken van theologie. Tegelijkertijd doe ik een aantal aanbevelingen voor de praktijk. Zoals bijvoorbeeld het ontwikkelen van rituelen met, voor en door slachtoffers van trauma. Ik eindig waar ik begon. Bij het dansen en vooral bij de tekening van Thomas en Jezus. Ooit was de tekening die u ziet glad, maar nu is hij verkreukeld. Een uitbarsting van mijn eigen frustratie zorgde ervoor dat hij verfrommeld in de prullenbak belandde. De kreukels krijg ik niet meer uit de tekening. De kreukels krijg ik niet uit de verhalen van de vrouwen die ik sprak. De kreukels krijg ik niet uit mijn eigen verhaal. De kreukels krijg ik niet meer glad gestreken, maar ze vormen nu wel de voorkant van mijn proefschrift. De kreukels mogen gezien worden. En dat is waar mijn onderzoek in de kern over gaat. Hoe kunnen we de kreukels zien, erkennen en er misschien zelfs wel mee dansen?
We will now proceed to the defense, and I open this public session of the Doctoral Board of the Protestant Theological University with a prayer. Merciful God, clothed in wisdom and glory, source of joy and light, we pray to you, grant us wisdom and insight through Jesus Christ, in whom all treasures of wisdom and knowledge are hidden. Amen. Please be seated. The Doctoral Board now gives you, Marie Hansen-Couturier, the opportunity to publicly defend your dissertation and the propositions added to it. I give the floor to our first opponent, who is present with us online, Professor Dr. Juliana Claassens, Professor of Old Testament and Head of the Gender Unit of the Faculty of Theology of Stellenbosch. Welcome to our university, also, even though it's virtually and online, but we welcome you here, and I'd like to invite you to start the opposition.
Introductory remarks and just the very poetic way that you express also the intent of what you do and how theology and art is integrated throughout. Before I ask my questions, maybe just one, last week we had a big conference about at university, and one of the speakers spoke on the text of John 20 the wounds of Thomas. And there was this artwork that he showed that I've never seen before, but on the wounds. So the wounds are still there, but they were turned into butterflies. So it's actually a very interesting, the scars, but then also something of transforming the wounds into, something, life-giving and beautiful. But my first question, so to ask you regarding your study, and that concerns the role of the Bible in trauma theology. So I'm a professor in Hebrew Bible. And my question would be, why in your groups that you worked with, why would one read biblical text in the engagement with sexual abuse survivors? Would any other literary text, poem, or novel, or maybe a film even suffice? So maybe you can reflect a bit on how the Bible features in the original course, as well as how trauma hermeneutics may enhance trauma theology's engagement with biblical text.
Highly learned opponent, thank you for your presence here today and for your question. about the role of the Bible in trauma theology and about why we read the Bible texts in the original course. The course was organized by VPSG, an organization who offers counseling and support for survivors of sexualized abuse and who struggle with questions regarding faith. And and I think in a course in that setting, it is quite fitting to read Bible texts because they're most likely part of the life world of the participants. So for them, struggling with faith and with their past and the combination of faith and past, this may raise all kinds of questions, some of which I touched upon, of course, in my introductory talk about the role of God, for instance. And to address such questions, I think the Bible is one of the texts which could be very fitting to address these questions. And also because likely the Bible plays a role in the questions that these participants in this course may have. So it has to do, in my opinion, especially with the target audience of the course.
Thank you. Maybe regarding my second question, will maybe make my position a bit clearer, because there's in the biblical text, Hebrew Bible, there's at least also, there are a number of texts, that are, very specifically dealing also with sexual violence and abuse, and also even a God, as an abuser or as a rapist, even in terms of, Jeremiah 13 and elsewhere. So my second question was also, the choice of your text that you chose. I mean, so you chose Genesis 12, Exodus 20, Genesis 32, Luke 13, and then John 20, which you also reference in your open introductory remarks, which with Shelley Rambo's exegesis, which is beautiful, sort of shows, I think, a bit more the value of trauma hermeneutics and reading these texts through a trauma lens. So in that I could see how a trauma theology really guided the interpretation of the text. So maybe this is a two-part question then. So in the first part, why these particular texts, when there are so many other biblical texts that address specifically sexual abuse and, even with a God who is sort of a violator, maybe to find ways to challenge that. But then on the other hand, how would, as a biblical scholar, I would always ask, how do you bridge the divide between in-depth exegetical work and hermeneutical work? There's many people writing, specifically on reading texts through a trauma lens. And how this may be used in to enhance the engagement also with the lived reality of sexual abuse survivors with whom you engaged.
Yes. So the first part of your question, why specifically these texts? That is a question that I actually discussed with the instructors of the course. It was something that I was curious about as well. They were not texts that I chose. Just to clarify this, this was part of the course as it was designed by the course instructors. But we did speak about this question. So why would we choose these texts, or why were these texts chosen? And part of the answer, which is, I think, important to mention, is that the focus of the course was very specifically looking towards the future. To translate the title of the course, it is God and I, How to Proceed with God After Sexualized Abuse. So it is not so much about dwelling on what was, as it is about grappling in a tentative way, though, in a tentative way, grappling with what is and what is yet to be. So these texts were chosen with that perspective in mind. So I think that's an important factor. And then the second part of your question, if I understood correctly, please correct me if I didn't quite get it, but you were asking how to bridge the divide between deep exegetical work and the more lived experience and the hermeneutics, right? The trauma hermeneutics.
Yeah, maybe just to clarify also, you know, in biblical studies, there are, over the last, say, 10, 15 years, there's been rich trauma readings. There's a whole series on the trauma Bible. You know, many scholars, you know, sort of have really delved very deeply into biblical texts, but read through a trauma lens. So maybe just how that could maybe enhance what you do, how it speaks, not speaks to the lived experience of your participants.
Yes, thank you for clarifying that. I think in my study, the main focus indeed was the lived experience of the participants, much more so than the deep exegetical work. And that is a choice that I made, also a methodological choice that I made because I wanted to put the perspective of the participants to the fore, because these are perspectives that are often not heard, and these are interpretations that are often not heard. And to give these a platform, I think that was the main focus of what I was getting at with my work. And I think it would have been very interesting to put all of the texts that we discussed in the course to the front and to dive deeply into them, or as deep as I did with the text about Thomas and Jesus. The study is already quite long, and that might have made it even a bit longer. So within the scope of what was possible within my research project, this was a focal point that I took, inspired also by the work of Shelley Rambo, which you already mentioned.
Thank you. And we don't want to make the answer longer as well. So we thank you very much for your question and this first answer. And we continue now with Professor Danielle Tumino Hansen. Professor Tumino is Professor of Practical Theology and Spiritual Care at the Kendler School of Theology at Emory University in the United States. Thank you very much for joining us and welcome to this session, and the floor is yours.
Yes, of course. I'm delighted to be here this morning and to be in conversation with you, Marie. I was, like Professor Claassens, deeply moved by your project. As someone who writes in this field, both someone who's written a book on trauma generally, on sexual harm specifically, and who is also a rape survivor, I understand the heaviness, to use your word in your speech, that engaging this material involves. So I wanted to start by commending you for bringing your whole self to a project that requires vulnerability. And vulnerability is not something we often teach people in academia how to employ well. So thank you for doing that for us. I wanted to ask you first about the research method that you employed, so this qualitative method. Qualitative research has both pros and cons, and one of its pros is that it offers us a chance to really gain nuanced and textured wisdom from a small sample size. And one of the cons is that it often can't be generalized out of that small sample size. I was wondering if you could talk about some of the limits you encountered by employing this methodology in your work.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for raising this question. Thank you for your kind words, and also for sharing. The limits of the qualitative methodology, indeed, I fully agree with you that it is a small sample size that I work with, and that it is not necessarily very easy to generalize from this, but I do think it can be done. I think that some of the recommendations that I make are applicable outside of this small context that my research took place in. And another limit that I encountered with the specific research methodology that I employed was, of course, that I struggled with the balance between the researcher and the person that I am. And that is something that you already mentioned at the beginning, that this is hard at times to balance this. And at the same time, I do think this really means that what comes out of the research is something valuable, is something, like you said, nuanced and textured. I like that word. It has, you can hold on to it. It yields something. So yes, I do stand by the methodology as I employed it, and if I were to do such a project again, which is not likely, but if I were, I would do it the same way again. I would do it in a qualitative way again.
Thank you. I tell my doctoral students that my hope for them is that they will use the time in the doctoral program to craft a project that only they could write. And you have given us a project that only you could have written. And some of what you noted about your interactions as a researcher and as a person who brings their own lived experience to the research make you uniquely situated to do this project. You know, this time that we have together today is kind of a very thin liminal time between you being a full-blown doctoral student and the student now becoming the teacher, now, you know, really living into your expertise, having defended. And so I wanted to take that thin sliver to ask you to think into the future and to ask what avenues of future research you discovered from completing this project and what questions you still have that you'd like to answer once this defense is over.
Very learned opponent. I love the idea of looking into the future because I love the idea of some of the things that come out of this research to continue. This is, there are, of course, things that I found and couldn't fully dive into. And one of those things which really keeps occupying my mind also is how this, how the system and how all the, well, let me rephrase that, how all the systems that are at play when it comes to sexualized abuse, how this works for men or those who identify as male. I've specifically focused in my study on the experience of women, and I outline the reasons for that in my book. And I do really stand behind that choice as well. But that is not to say that sexualized abuse doesn't concern men. It does. And it does happen to them. And other systems of power and shame, and there are different dynamics at play. That's the word I was looking for. So that would be something that I would be really interested in to take further in a further along the line in the future.
Thank you very much. Are you satisfied with the answer?
Yes, I am, and I think that it's a very important avenue for research to continue looking into.
Thank you so much. Thank you for answering. We go on to our next guest, although a guest is a strong word for someone who also originated in this university, and we would like to ask Professor van Klinken to continue the discussion. Professor van Klinken is Professor of Religion and African Studies and Deputy Head of the School for Theology and Religious Studies at the University of Leeds. Welcome to our university, your university, and we give the floor to you.
Thank you so much, Professor Reisma, for welcoming me back. And thank you so much, Marie, for the opportunity to engage with your work, which offers us so many rich insights. The previous question already referred to one of the distinct characteristics of your thesis, which is the commitment that you demonstrate to self-reflexivity in the process of doing research and writing the thesis. And I would like to reiterate how important this is, especially because of the vulnerability that this requires from you as a researcher. Now, I'd like to draw your attention to a sentence that you write yourself on page 42, where you write, "Including my personal experience is a way of writing my own body into the text, and a way of reflecting on my own body amidst bodies during the courses. In this way, I hope this research project will not only be about body theology, but that it will be a small piece of body theology itself." End of quote. And my question to you is here, could you give one or two examples of how the research, as a result of this commitment, has become a piece of body theology itself? And could you elaborate on the underlying notion of body theology here? Is body theology a performative praxis?
Highly learned opponent. Thank you for your question. Yes, I'm just taking a moment to read with you the quote here. And it was something that has puzzled me actually from the start. So there's not one clear-cut answer that comes to my mind right now, but I would like to take you with me in my search on how I've tried to grapple with this throughout the time of my dissertation. There is, for me, a kind of, it almost seems like an opposite to want to do something with your body in theology and then go and write a book about it. It seems like these are two opposite avenues that one is taking. And that is something that has puzzled me from the start. How do I engage with body theology, theology about the body, theology that puts the body to the fore in a positive way? And how do I take bodies of my research respondents, but also my own body, into this project? And how do we turn this then into a book? And one way of dealing with this question is that I chose to spend a whole chapter on the VPSG course and to really describe what happened there. So to really describe all the dancing that we did and to include drawings from myself, but also from some of the respondents. As drawings, they do something different. When you look at them, looking at a drawing is different than reading a text. It elicits a different response in the mind and in the body. So this is, that's my tentative searching for how to deal with this. Does that answer your question?
Certainly does, and I should indeed underline the importance of the dance and your very thick description of the dance and the paintings as well. I guess you are understating yourself and you say that you ended up writing a book about it because you did more than that. The very rich narratives about the dance, which are very lively, I guess is an example of how body theology becomes a performative praxis, right, in the dance performances. Now, if I may, I would like to kind of follow up on that with a second question, exactly about that, the methodology of you participating in these dance sessions. How do you understand the relationship between your body and the bodies of your participants? So in the quote that I drew attention to, you use the term body amongst bodies, but in Stelling 8, the statement that accompanies your thesis, you also highlight the risk of disguising the hierarchical power structures that are still in place. So there seems to be a tension here between your body as one among other bodies and this notion that there is still a power hierarchy. How did you deal with that in the process of undertaking the research?
Yes, there's definitely a tension between understanding and wanting to be also a body amongst bodies and wanting to fully participate in the course, and at the same time realizing that I'm still the researcher, that I'm still the one designing the interview questions, and I'm still the one writing the book eventually. So there's a tension there, and that's something that I cannot fully solve as well. And I think it's important to take the step to acknowledge this, and that's something that I also write in my methodology, that this tension is there and that the hierarchy is there. I think it's very important that we don't fall into the pitfall of too easily assuming that we're the same as the people that we're researching as researchers, because of the reasons that I just mentioned.
Are you satisfied with the answers, Professor van Klinken?
Thank you. Yes, for the time being, I am.
All right, thank you very much. And we'll proceed and come back to the table, from the screen to the table. And I would like Professor Dorothea Noch to continue the discussion. Professor Noch is Professor of Theology and Migration here at the Protestant Theological University. And I gladly give you the floor.
Thank you. Esteemed candidate, let's go back to the Bible, to the first question. And now, let's go back from the discipline of systematic theology. You have been experimenting with a sort of contextual biblical interpretation in your book. And you generated data, you were part of your data. And especially in chapter 5, you lead us into a components of a trauma-sensitive theology after sexualized abuse. My question would be, what exactly are the starting points? Perhaps in your case, the principles, the hermeneutical principles for a contextual biblical interpretation for a trauma-sensitive theology.
Highly learned opponent. Yes, let's go back to the Bible. That's fitting also for my research project, so fitting for the context that we're in this church today. What are the starting points, the principles for the hermeneutics of a trauma-sensitive theology? I think the most important starting point is to start with the reader response. So to start with the experience of the respondents who are reading the texts. So I think in a trauma-sensitive theology, it's important to hear, first of all, to hear those who have been traumatized, and to see what their experiences are with reading a text. And that is something that I have tried to do in my study. And at the same time, there are, of course, some starting points which I go back to, starting points for what exactly is a trauma-sensitive theology to begin with. And in that, it is important, first of all, also to include the body and to include the body and to go from the experiences that are stored in that body and to take that into how you read a text as well.
Professor Claassens already pushed a little bit further this question in terms of like, is it not the very moment of choosing a text? And then you nicely referred back that the texts were already given, so you washed your hand on that place, but I don't think you can wash it now. So when it comes to you being the theologian who selects Bible texts or sources from the Bibles, is that not the starting principle before you end up with a reader's response? And how would you go about that?
Yes, I cannot wash my hands this time, you're right. No, I don't want to. I think this is true, and this also has to do with hierarchy again, and with power, and with who decides on what we're reading. So it would be very interesting to have a project where the respondents are the ones bringing the texts to the table and where they say, well, this is a text that I struggle with, or this is a text that really helps me, because those are, of course, responses that can both come from different Bible texts. I think that in choosing the texts that we did for this project, I was, of course, at the end of the day, I was the one who decided to focus on this text of Thomas and Jesus, and that's a choice that I explained more about why this particular text, also referring back, as I mentioned before, to the work of Shelley Rambo. And I think there's so much in this text, but of course there are other texts as well which could have been chosen. So, yeah.
Have you considered for a moment to prolong the pericope from John 20 and not finish it with 29, but go for 30, 31, and 32 instead?
Would have been interesting indeed. I haven't up until now considered it. I'm considering it as we speak. I wonder if that would have changed the reading of it. It could have, and then I think that illustrates your point that you're making in how there's also power in choosing the text and choosing the pericope.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm looking at the chair whether my time is finished or whether I can still continue with my row of questions.
You still have a little bit of time for your second question.
So the second question is, now that you touched a little bit upon these departing points, well, principles for a contextual hermeneutics of contextual Bible interpretation for the sake of systematic theology, which lemmas of the systematic theology would you critically address through the 4 criteria which you formulate for a trauma-sensitive theology, namely embodied, constructive, transformative, and beyond words? So how would your use hermeneutics from a systematic point of view of the Bible critically address certain lemmas of systematic theology after this research?
Highly learned opponent, could I ask you to clarify the lemmas that you're getting at?
In that particular chapter, chapter 5, you list a couple of big words: resurrection, resurrection of the body, hope, And then in chapter 6, you continue with witness. What happens to those lemmas after your research in the so-called classical type of, white men written systematic theologies?
Thank you for your clarification. I think my research shows that, first of all, and that's an open door perhaps, but that we need a trauma-sensitive theology to look at these lemmas precisely because of how they have been interpreted before. And I discussed this, for instance, when it comes to the resurrection, which I also tie, of course, to what happens before the resurrection, what happens to Jesus on the cross, and how this has been, in certain traditions, it has been and continues to be glorified in a sense, which is not helpful for trauma survivors. And that is an insight that goes way back from feminist theology. So we need trauma-sensitive theology to rethink these concepts. And I think what I've also tried to show in my research is that trauma shatters. Trauma shatters the basic assumptions that we have of safety, of our place in the world, of our relationship to God, of how we look at concepts like these. Trauma shatters so much. And a trauma-sensitive theology can help to piece things back together, to, in a creative way and in a transformative way, look anew, through a new lens, at these lemmas, and to see what is needed from the perspective of trauma survivors.
Thank you very much. As white male acting rector, I am very interested to see what will come out of that. And now give the floor to my colleague, Professor Erik Olsman, who is a professor of chaplaincy studies here at the Protestant Theological University. And the floor is yours.
Thank you. Esteemed PhD candidate, until for a short time now, we'll continue. Congratulations on this important dissertation, which I have read with great attention. I hope that at some point we will no longer need to use the term trauma-sensitive, because all theology will then be trauma-sensitive. Let's hope for it. I have questions about the concepts you address. First of all, narrativity. You state that you wish to reflect on the stories of survivors, but then I got surprised that you primarily conduct thematic analysis in your analysis of interviews. Why not primarily narrative analysis? For example, focusing on structures, perspectives, roles, and metaphors. And maybe you can also answer this question: what might such narrative analysis have yielded?
Highly learned opponent. Narrativity is such it's one of my methodological commitments that I make to focus on narrativity, and at the same time I describe how this is a difficult task if we understand narrativity only in the sense of focusing on the words, and because since trauma is that what often goes beyond words and which shatters, as I was just saying, it also shatters language, and words often fail. So yes, my focus was on the stories of survivors, and at the same time the analysis, and I also describe how the process of analysis and of the coding of my interviews was quite a task, to put it lightly. And I think the thematic approach that I took, it helped me to make sense of the quite large amount of data that I had, and the different amounts of different types of data. that my research yielded. So there were the field notes, and then there were the interviews, and then there were my own descriptions and the drawings. And it was very easy to get lost in the process of analyzing that. So the thematic approach helped me to make sense and to get some order in this.
Yeah. So you say you had several data, different data sets. So that's one reason, and another one is to because then it always gets a bit more eclectic, right? When you cut it into pieces, and then it's about the same theme, and there you have that theme, and there you have that theme as well. But it gets a bit scattered. So that was it made me wonder, could it have made sense as well to see each interview as a whole, for example? I fully agree that there's more than words. Yeah.
Yes, and I do agree with you that it would have been a different approach to see, to take the point of view of the narrative analysis and to see each interview as a story, so to say. And there are stories, and yet they're also connected. And I think the thematic analysis helps to also draw attention to the connectedness and to the shared experience of trauma, whilst I don't want to generalize it.
Yeah, I agree on that. Yeah, another concept you also use is the concept of witness, which has also been described in narrative theory quite a bit. So my questions are related. And I also think it's an important concept, but I also wonder, precisely the concept of testimony often revolves around the reliability of the witness and the reliability of the testimony. So that made me wonder, isn't it risky to use that concept specifically in the context of sexualized abuse? After all, the reliability of survivors has been called into question more than once.
Yes, and that raises in me the question of what do we mean with reliability? And do we understand reliability to mean factually correct? And is it about getting at a factual truth? Or is it about getting at the experience of what someone has just experienced?
So my point is not to critique the reliability of the testimony, but to critique or ask you critically, is it wise to use the concept of witness in such a context? Because it comes with all these kind of connotations we probably both don't like.
Yes, yes, thank you for clarifying that. It is something that I do discuss at the beginning of the chapter, how the context of the Holocaust has put a large question mark around this whole concept of witness, about how can you witness something that is unwitnessable? How can you witness to atrocities that are too large to understand and to make sense of? And I think witnessing, the concept as I employ it, is not so much about having to do with a factual correct testimony or factually correct reliability, but it has to do with presence. It has to do with being with what is at that moment. And that is something I think that is very important for trauma survivors, because there was, in almost every case, no witness available to them when it comes to what happened to them. And if there was a witness, it was not a witness who was on their side. So, yeah.
Thank you. There's still time? Well, then I can even go to my second question, which is a quite different one. But it's at the end of your thesis. In your first recommendation, you state that attention must be paid to trauma and its consequences in ministerial training and education. I'm curious who you have in mind here. In the very first year of our 3-year master's program, mental health issues, including trauma, are covered in considerable detail. And apparently one of the teachers is here, myself. Furthermore, just last week I provided continuing education to pastors who recently began their ministry. There we addressed physical and psychological consequences of trauma, among other topics, as well as critical questions regarding traditional theological notions that tend to belittle rather than empower survivors. So it made me suspect you might have had other things in mind when you wrote this recommendation as well, or perhaps not, and it's good to focus on it, I agree, but perhaps you could elaborate a bit on this recommendation.
I'm actually very glad that you're drawing attention to this, and I'm very glad to hear that there are, everything that you just said, that there are things being taught and taking place. It is something that I don't remember from my training, so with that in mind, I did write this recommendation because I do think it's important to be part of the curriculum, and I think we agree on this. I think it's just to put this in a recommendation is also to draw a renewed attention to this, and to say, well, this is something that really needs to happen. Yeah. It's crucial. Yes.
Yeah, and I agree. It links to the thing you said earlier that. That we need to pay attention to it all the time again. I would say, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. So we agree on this indeed. I must admit, of course, it's one of the many topics you always have to discuss. So full understanding from a trauma lens, I think that's what you helped us with through your thesis, to go to the topic and to the field from all kinds of perspectives. That's very helpful.
You're satisfied so far?
I am.
Good. We have a little bit more time. I'm looking at the screen. If someone is happy to continue the discussion. I don't see any.
Hi.
Yes, please, go ahead.
Yes, so thank you. If I can maybe just continue the conversation also about the Bible, sorry. But what Dorothea also raised. And I'm just wondering, again, for me, it's so interesting to maybe even going further, just the possibility of trauma readings of biblical texts to do exactly what you've been doing. And maybe one example, this morning I taught on the Psalms and trauma readings of that. And it was so interesting just reading, texts that move from trauma to resilience. It created this space. A couple of students, sort of started talking about some of their own trauma experience, ended up like 3 students have lost children. That they've never spoken about this. So I'm just, I'm a firm believer of the biblical text, create that safe space in which people then can speak about their experiences. I would just encourage you for future work. Not, the power of the organizer to choose the text. You can choose texts that can really create the space for people to open up, but then also move beyond, the suffering.
Thank you. And I think it's... May I finish my sentence or no?
You may finish your sentence.
I may finish my sentence.
It depends on how long the sentence will be.
I will keep it brief. I think it's very important to keep in mind that the Bible has this vast array of texts, and that they can elicit all these different things, from rage to lament to understanding to love to, yeah.
Thank you. The doctoral board has heard your defense and will now withdraw to deliberate. the session is suspended. The session is resumed. Mrs. PhD candidate, to say it very formally, the doctoral board has reviewed your dissertation and heard your defense. And the board has decided to award you the doctorate. And therefore I now invite your promoter, Professor Dr. Helene Zorgdrager, to confer this dignity upon you in the customary manner.
By virtue of the authority granted to us by law, and according to the decision of the doctoral committee present here, I hereby declare you, Marie Hansen-Couturier, to be promoted to doctor, with all rights and responsibilities attached thereto by law and tradition, with respect to science, church, and society. As proof of this, we, your promoters, hand you the diploma, signed by the rector and first promoter, and sealed with the great seal of the university.
Moet ik blijven staan? Moet ik blijven staan? Ja. Dankjewel.
November 2018, dear Marie, you rang the bell of my house where I've been staying. Sorry, start again. Upon an early evening in November 2018, dear Marie, you rang the bell of the house where I'd been staying in Princeton in the USA. That was the first time we met. You had come to informally discuss your PhD plans with a stranger from South Africa. You and Isa had been visiting your father Ed and Inge, who were our neighbors in the housing provided by the Center for Theological Inquiry. That evening, I met a warm, modest, yet well-read and quietly determined person who knew exactly what she wanted to accomplish with her study. I liked you instantly and was intrigued by your project. I was therefore extraordinarily happy when I was later invited along on this journey with Helene Zorgdrager as promoter. Although I sat far away in Stellenbosch, and maybe 90% of our meetings were courtesy of MS Teams, you and Helene always took great care to include me fully, not only in the academic conversations and the planning right from the start, but even generously and hospitably in your pre-existing years-long friendship. The online sessions were always productive meetings of minds, but they were also meetings of fully embodied friends, embedded in networks of relationships, people who cared about one another's ups and downs. Also for this reason, the times that we could meet in person are memorable. Under the massive oak trees and the overarching mountains at a coffee shop on Helshoogte Paas near Stellenbosch, in a station cafe near Utrecht Centraal. In an ideal world, time would stand still, life itself would go quiet while one embarks on a PhD study. But of course, the opposite is usually the case. Since that evening in Princeton, a great deal happened. COVID happened, which meant that the VPSG course, that was the integral part of your study, was postponed. You and Isa became parents twice. There were periods of unintentional standstill and a long path of recovery. And the study became interrupted by, yet interwoven with, and enriched by all these twists and turns of a full young life.
After your impactful master thesis on the problem of forgiveness after sexual abuse in 2019, it was clear for everyone inside and outside PTHU that you should continue with a PhD research. No one was better equipped, both intellectually and in sensitivity, to work on this important topic within the field of theology than you. Everyone was convinced. Yet there remained one stubborn doubter. You know her all too well. Marie, you have described your journey as a PhD researcher as a walk, not an ommetje, but perhaps better, a challenging hike. And you specified, it is a path on which I encounter myself and a path where my body often speaks louder than my head. At times, you would be annoyed with your body. With your desire for doing theology in an absolute honest, experiential way, you didn't make it easy for yourself. Precisely the body, the flesh, was the central concept and the starting point of your project. How can theology speak truly from within our fleshy, vulnerable existence? How can theology take the voices and existential struggles of survivors of sexual abuse as point of departure and become relevant to the wounds and resilience of embodied lives? It became clear for you that you couldn't leave your own body out, whatever it would take. You took the risks, and we praise you for that. The result is this, a unique book, the diary of engaged walking with the wounded, both academic and in prophetic accompaniment. You dedicated it to those who told me their stories and to those whose stories still remain silent. Now that we can look back on a daring and courageous hike, and I hope you'll agree, I think that it is time to say grace to the body that often spoke louder than the head. The head became a careful listener and heard things that had not been attended to by theological scholarship before. The voices, gestures, drawings, tears, and dances of the survivor participants became a source of new religious meaning making. And the head, it just followed, was turned upside down and inside out, shook off what had no future, and generated novel insights, a transformative, trauma-sensitive God talk. Likewise important are the recommendations that follow for an improved church praxis. So, well, the daughter of two theologians who never wanted to become a theologian herself, of course not, now combines the best of two parental worlds, both being a pastor and being an academic with the level of highest achievement. We are confident, Marie, that you will proceed your innovative theological walk with curiosity and care, wherever the professional life may take you. It will always be in solidarity with those who long for life to the full.
Finally, we too, as your Dr. Mutter, warmly congratulate you on this milestone. It has been a privilege and a pleasure to walk with you on such a journey of discovery. We also extend our congratulations to Isa, Amos, Eileen, to Katrin, Ed, and Inge, and to all the circles that surround you with love and happiness on this festive day.
On behalf of the doctoral board, I also would like to congratulate you on the dignity you have obtained. You have done a lot of work, intense work, nice work. There's still a lot more work to do to make the church, theology, and the world a safer place. So we pray for a blessing on your life, your work, and your future studies. I would like to invite you to sign the album. I will now conclude this session with the doxology, and I ask you to stand, please. The Almighty God, by whose light we see light, to him be the glory forever and ever through Jesus Christ. Amen.